Okay, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to add my welcome to those thoughts that John shared, and we appreciate his perspective. World Affairs Council of Philadelphia certainly appreciates the collaboration that enabled today's conference with Drexel University and the Franklin Institute. So we have three Philadelphia civic and educational institutions coming together, and the goal is to enhance the understanding in our community of the very important issues that we all face today and that we'll discuss during the course of the afternoon. I'd like to thank John and his team here at Drexel for their hospitality and their great efforts in bringing together the conference today. Likewise, I'd also like to recognize Larry Dubinsky, the president and CEO of the Franklin Institute, for the role the Institute has played in getting us to today's conference. I'd like to thank Stan and Arlene Ginsberg and their family foundation for setting forth a challenge grant in 2013, without which the Great Debate Series would not be possible. And that series is certainly typified here today, where you run through a range of critical topics and gain different perspectives on those topics from a panel such as we're going to hear from in a few minutes. So it's a really great institute or setup to promote the type of discussion that's so important from the World Affairs Council's perspective. In addition to the Ginsbergs, I'd also like to extend my thanks to SCI and Amatech for meeting that 2013 challenge grant, along with UGI Corporation. Now I'd like to welcome Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, to set the stage to begin today's program. Craig?
Thanks to John and John. Let me turn right to the substance of our program for today, the rest of our conference. I am a child of the 1960s, a time which I think will be remembered as one of the high watermarks of technological optimism. While the era was filled with social and political turmoil and considerable uncertainty about the direction of human affairs in those areas, the advance of technology appeared to us at the time a kind of bright light towards which we could happily and perhaps inevitably march. On Christmas Eve, 1968, the year in which the Tet Offensive occurred in Vietnam, Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, and so much other bad news filled the world's attention. On Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 astronauts, the first humans ever to leave Earth's gravity and the first to see the dark side of the moon, read to the world from the book of Genesis. Anyone who heard that was transported to a better place. And then, of course, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and our distinguished guest later today, Buzz Aldrin, landed and walked on the moon. In that time, we, the children of the 1960s, knew what technological progress was going to look like. It was going to create a world, or rather worlds, that we watched on Star Trek. The original series, the original Star Trek series, was set in the 23rd century. Some of its projections for the future, like faster than speed of light travel and teleportation, may never be possible. But in some ways, only 50 years into that projection of 300, many of the fantastical imaginings of Star Trek's creators are in our pockets today. We can communicate with anyone, anywhere, nearly, from these small boxes we carry around all the time, and we can access them through them nearly all of the knowledge that the human race has ever created. But even then, and certainly since, there has also been a dystopian current in the imagining of the human race about the future of a world fashioned by technology. We have seen movies and films in which humans come to control genetics, but that control is used only for the benefit of a privileged few, turned into fascist-like discrimination against those who are, quote, less perfect humans. We see fantasy in which artificial intelligence is perfected, but that intelligence turns on us, enslaves us, destroys us, or perhaps just turns out the lights, in which case we serve a pre-technological kind of world. So we have this sort of nearly utopian vision of Star Trek, with its non-invasive but overwhelmingly effective medicine and its conception of a world of such material abundance that money, as we understand it, disappears, contrasted with these horrific visions of apocalypse and beyond at the hands of our own inventions. Of course, the truth may well be, and probably will be, neither extreme, but somewhere along the countless points in the spectrum in between. Much good, much progress, but also many unforeseen and difficult consequences that have to be managed. And those are our themes for today. We've assembled a diverse and extremely knowledgeable and I think insightful group of people to help guide us through these questions. It is not our intention to answer them, but to get you to think deeply about them as you go forward from today. Our first session will deal with the internet and the new global connectedness and ask the question, is that connectedness an unequaled incubator for innovation, or the death of privacy and civility, or somewhere in between? Our first panelist is Susan Herman, the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Susan holds a chair as Centennial Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School, where she currently teaches courses in constitutional law and criminal procedure, and seminars on law and literature and terrorism and civil liberties. She's joined by Lawrence Husick, who is co-chairman at the Center for the Study of Terrorism and co-director of the Wachman Center's program on teaching innovation, both at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where he applies his background in both law and technology to the study of innovation as an organizing principle in history, society, technology, economics, and sociology. And finally, last but certainly not least, Ed Lee, managing editor at Recode, rounds out our panel. Edmund has been a journalist for 2 decades and has worked for or contributed to various newsrooms and websites, including the New York Times, Portfolio Magazine, and Vibe. He was most recently at Bloomberg News and Business Week magazine, where he covered media and occasionally, and this is his word, jabbered on Bloomberg TV. Our guests will each make opening remarks, and then we will engage in conversation on these issues, and finally open to questions from you. So I start with opening from Susan Herman.
Thank you, Carl, and good afternoon. So if you notice the ACLU table on your way in, you would have seen some materials on one of the things the ACLU has been concerned about in connection with technology, and that is the ubiquity of government surveillance. One of my favorite recent cartoons in the New Yorker shows people sitting around a table, obviously meant to be the NSA, and one of them is saying to the other people, "Get me everything on everybody." Now, in addition to the ACLU being generally interested in these issues, lobbying, litigating, etc., I wrote a book myself about the impact of all the post-9/11 expansions of surveillance and various other kinds of changes of the law on ordinary Americans. And one reason why I wrote this book was that I found that a lot of people know about the government surveillance, what the NSA is doing. We know a lot more now since Edward Snowden, of course. But even after the USA Patriot Act, people were aware of the fact that surveillance was being supersized on this kind of dragnet theory. If we have all this information, then chances are we might be able to catch a terrorist if that information would lead us to something. Now, I think what people don't know is, first of all, this dragnet surveillance is a lot less effective than you might think. There have been some recent studies, which I could talk about during Q&A if you like, and the costs are much greater than you might think. So I wanted in my opening remarks to address the big 2 questions that people ask about this who don't care and who have not yet joined the ACLU. Question number 1, why should I care what the government knows about me if I'm not doing anything wrong? Right, you heard that one? Okay, so part of my book deals with that, the answers to that question, and this isn't just about personal privacy. You know, some people say, well, Facebook knows all about me, who cares? Well, I think that what's at stake in government surveillance in particular, and we can talk later about the connections between government surveillance and corporate surveillance and what everyone knows about everybody. But I think that what's at risk is the aspect of privacy that actually supports democracy and supports our fundamental constitutional rights. So if you knew that somebody was watching you at all times, watching what you did, would you be as likely to express a controversial political opinion, to go to a mosque, or contribute to a Muslim charity if you thought that might end you up on a no-fly list, to join an unpopular organization? So I think one of the chief connections that I want to draw here is between privacy and democracy and all these freedoms. A very interesting attempt that I saw recently to try to quantify what this chilling effect might be, the chill on people's freedom of speech, association, religion, was done by the organization PEN, P-E-N, you know that, they're a group of writers and authors. They did 2 studies, one about a year and a half ago they did domestically, and then they followed it up with an international study. And what they did was they asked all the authors and journalists, et cetera, a series of questions. Since 9/11, now that you know about all this government surveillance, especially since Edward Snowden has told us how ubiquitous it is, have you been censoring yourself in any way? Are there subjects that you don't research, that you don't write about, that you're afraid to email about? And they have concrete questions, and I would urge you, if you're interested, to look up their data. I thought 5 minutes was too short to inflict a PowerPoint on you, so I'm just using my words and telling you. But they found that something like 1/6 of the people who they interviewed in this country said yes, they had censored themselves. They were afraid to write about the Middle East. They were afraid to communicate with people in different parts of the world. They were afraid to look up things about infrastructures of dams or nuclear power because they were concerned about what might happen as a result. And another 1/6 said they had at least thought of doing so. So I think it's pretty clear that there is a chilling effect. Right after we found out about the metadata bulk collection program, about the government is getting everybody's telephone numbers that you call and from which you receive calls, the ACLU immediately filed a lawsuit because Verizon was doing that, and we're a client of Verizon. Our high school students who are feeling bullied by their school principal, or government employees who want to be whistleblowers, or police officers who believe that they've had unfair disciplinary proceedings, are they going to call the ACLU to ask for help if they believe that that telephone connection is going to be in a government database someplace? So the chilling effect, I think, is very important. Now, I started this part with a joke, so let me ask you, since the Edward Snowden revelations, in the past year and a half, how many of you have either made or heard a joke about the NSA? Right? Better be careful not to say that. The NSA might be watching. My hard drive crashed. I better call the NSA and see if they can replace it. Okay, you're worried. So we are worried, and when you're worried, when you believe that Big Brother might be watching, you are going to be chilled. So that's my very brief answer, for time permitting, to why should I care what the government knows about me if I'm not doing anything wrong? You could end up on the no-fly list. The second question, I'll be even briefer. The second question is, why should I care what the government knows about me when Facebook and Google and all sorts of corporations and people know all these things about me anyway? What's the difference? The difference is, last time I looked, Facebook and Amazon could not arrest you or put you on the no-fly list. So I'm going to leave my opening remarks there, and I'll look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As a student and teacher and practitioner of innovation and of science and engineering and technologies that produce innovation, and like Craig, as a child of the Star Trek generation, I have a slightly different view of that television series, particularly the original one. And that view was shared by Gene Roddenberry, the series creator, whose view was that Star Trek represented a view of, in his words, how humans address our most basic social and ethical dilemmas, even as we continue to expand the horizons of our knowledge of the universe and more powerful technologies. Star Trek, for all of those futuristic toys, also dealt right on with racism, with sexism, militarism, the Cold War, ecological destruction, population control, biotechnology, and a host of other important issues of its time and of ours. And like much science fiction, the writers recognized that all scientific knowledge and technology is fundamentally morally neutral. It is how the technology is employed that imparts a moral imperative in one direction or another. And it is our responsibility as those who employ it to erect ethical frameworks for its use and application. Sadly, our legal and social institutions, and I am a lawyer, are ill-equipped to deal with rapid technological change. And this is very easy to understand. The law is a conservative small c institution. The law looks backward to precedent, and the principle of stare decisis requires that in order to provide a predictable framework for dispute resolution, we do exactly that. While science and technology is entirely forward-looking, as Max Planck said, science precedes the death of one scientist at a time. And so we have social institutions that are ill-prepared to deal with our era of exponential growth in knowledge and technology. Technology is truly double-edged. The same impulses that gave us Napster and worldwide stealing of online music also gave rise to a worldwide resurgence in the popularity and viability of great orchestras and opera companies. The same big data tools that allow the NSA to spy on everyone everywhere, and Google and Facebook to know the same, also suggest movies we may want to watch, books that we should read, and enable public health initiatives that may prove able to stop pandemics before they spread. The same service that brings us cat videos also brings us TED Talks, open universities, and the Khan Academy. There's always been a tremendous unease about the human costs of innovation. Writing in the early part of the last century, Ernst Heidegger complained of a newly instituted and widely spreading technology that was disrupting the face-to-face social interactions of European cities. What was he talking about? Indoor plumbing. Because indoor plumbing meant that women no longer went to the public well to fetch water and discuss the issues of the day. One can easily imagine an ancient Roman scribe bemoaning the installation of aqueduct-fed public fountains because women and slaves no longer went to the river to fetch water, wash clothes, and engage in public discourse. In every age, that new technology brings about it that same unease, that same loss of hallowed and cherished traditions. So in sum, in answering Craig's question, I would say that our new technology is neither a new beginning nor a terrible end, but it is a fundamental part of what it is to be human. You see, we're a lazy species. If there is an easier way to do something that involves technology, we'll invent it and use it, and we've been doing so since stone tools. The problem is that in prior generations, in prior ages, the pace of technological change was too slow to be noticed. It was measured in tens of generations. But our accreting base of knowledge means that we now live in internet years measured in 6-month increments. In a paper published in 1979, Hans Jonas, the philosopher of technology at the New School, concluded that it is our job never to allow humanity to get into a lifeboat situation, but that one part of the ethics of technology is precisely to guard the space in which any ethics of technology can survive. For the rest, he said, it must grapple with the cross currents of life in all its complexity. I look forward to today's discussions as we work with each other to seek ways to better the life of our fellow citizens on what I hope is not Lifeboat Earth.
Hello, folks. Good to be here today. I'll keep mine as brief as I can, given nice intros before. Unlike Craig, I am a child of the 80s. So looking across the room here, I'm probably a bit more of an edge case compared to what I see. For me, though, growing up, technology, and as it is for every generation growing up, technology was always an exciting prospect. Right, life will change, things will become better, and I think one of the things that people of my particular generation were grateful to see and witness and participate in is seeing a lot of what we imagined at the time, become reality. And I think specifically, computer technology is one aspect that a lot of people, when I was young, we latched onto and couldn't wait for it to be a reality. And even though there were computers here and there in major universities and corporations, home computers hadn't really been a reality till, the mid-'80s or so, or at least a widespread one. When I got my first computer, was 84, 85. It was a Commodore 64, and it was really awesome, and I opened it up, and I started tapping away at it, hooked it up to my TV monitor, and within minutes, I had sort of figured it out, but then was also incredibly disappointed because, and I knew this at the time, but it was, what we call today is a standalone device. It's not connected to anything. It was just exactly that. It's something that computed information, right? And I think for a lot of my generation, we thought of computers as naturally something that would be connected. The idea that you could communicate with people instantly was really the thing that we were all after, and really wasn't until the mid-late 90s, and this is when I started working in newsrooms, that started taking place. The commercial internet took off, and I remember distinctly I was working at the time, my first job was at the Village Voice, old lefty paper, it's still around. There were computers in the office, but they were just used for typesetting and word processing. And I was like, is there a way I can get this computer connected to the internet? And I had to finagle a connection to the fax machine, and I brought in my own modem, and I finally got it connected, and I had the one computer in the entire office that was connected to the internet. It was like 1994, 95. And people come over and look at this thing, and I log in. Of course, I was an oddity back then. They're like, why is this guy connecting his computer to the internet? Of course, now we don't even think twice about it. Our phones are connected constantly. And I guess the question I'd leave you guys with in terms of our discussion here, in terms of the framework of our discussion, is what is your role in the internet? We tend to think of a lot of how we thought about technology and how it could be terrifying or how it could be awesome. We had this sort of binary sense of it. There were us as human beings, and there was a computer that had all this store of knowledge. But the internet has actually proving sort of the opposite of that. The store of knowledge is still the human consciousness, the human society. When you type a question into Google, where's the answer coming from? It's not coming from a computer. It's coming from another human-fed piece of information. And I think that is a phenomenon and the real dynamic that's taking place in interconnectedness that I think should be considered and should be looked at more closely in terms of how we gauge whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
So I want to make sure, first of all, everyone speak as closely to the mics as you can so that everybody can be heard. I want to talk about connectedness and the good and the bad of connectedness. So there is this, there are times when the internet is discussed in sort of epochal terms, right? The creation of a single human kind of mass brain consciousness that's going to enable us to solve problems more quickly, more completely. That's one vision. But on the other side, there are people who argue that it's really, the internet has really become a corrosive force on human intellect, that we are distracted by endless volumes of meaningless information. Lawrence mentioned cute cat videos. Let's not forget pornography and status updates about where your friends are having breakfast on any given Sunday. So I'd like to ask what each of your take is on kind of the true significance of connectedness and sort of the ratio, if you will, of the good and the bad. We'll start with me.
I mean, despite being generally bullish, of course, about the, having an interconnectedness, I think a good example for me and my family, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she has grandparents live elsewhere in Houston and farther out on Long Island, even though we live in New York, and so. Talking to them on the phone is still a big part of it, but lately we use FaceTime. It's a huge thing for her to talk to her grandparents, and it's a very regular thing. And so be in the middle of making dinner and all of a sudden the tablet's going off and go check it. So that's an immediately nice and good thing, be able to visually see your family and friends and sort of interact in a way that is a little bit harder when you're just sort of blankly on the phone or, whether you're sending a letter or not. So that's, I think, a good example. I think a bad example, certainly, and I think this really started happening especially in workplaces where it became tethered to our BlackBerries once upon a time. I used to have the old alphanumeric one. I don't know if anyone you guys had that, but obsessively checking, and of course that hasn't really changed, and if anything, it's only become more widespread. And I think the idea that you're never fully off that interconnectedness has made you an always-on person in a weird way. And the decision to turn off is a decision. It isn't sort of a time of day anymore. And I think that's an example of a definite bad thing for sure.
I also would say, I think there are pros and cons. As Lawrence started us out, I think the technology isn't inherently good or evil. So the internet has a lot of pluses, from my point of view. The first, I think, is that this enormous access to information is something that should be very democratizing, that people can learn things, that they can reach out and sort of become better connected people. Another feature that I've seen is we have ACLU affiliates all over the country that have defended particularly students' rights to go on the internet. So if you are a gay high school student in Kansas, you may feel very isolated, and you may feel that you're having a very hard time with your community, feeling bullied. And the internet has really been a salvation for kids to be able to reach out beyond their neighborhood and find people who understand them and who are like-minded in other parts of the country. So I think those are tremendous advantages, both to the access to information and to the connectedness. However, on the other hand, I do worry that it's not about the access to information, but about the kind of connectiveness that we've become accustomed to on Facebook. I mean, it's great if everybody can express their opinions about things and we can find out what everybody thinks. But Michel Foucault says in Discipline and Punish that if you feel like people are watching you, at some point you internalize the gaze. And not only do you stop saying things that people are going to disagree with or taking actions that people might find unpopular or distasteful, but you're going to stop thinking those things and you're going to stop being that person. And my concern, and this is sort of related to the whole idea of the connection between privacy and democracy, is that all this connectedness has the potential to blunt our edges. That if we are constantly in a situation where we're not just connected, but we're hearing what everybody thinks about what we do. Okay, I just did this. Do you like it? Do you approve of it? How many people like it? How many people dislike it? Very hard then not to take that into account in what you're going to say or do or what groups you're going to join the next time. So I think we're just at the beginning of seeing what price all this connectedness has. In some ways it's very positive and very nice, but I think long term the combination of the government surveillance plus just all people, corporations, people all over the country having the ability to not just connect with you but essentially to watch you all the time. This is beyond Orwell. It's not just the government, it's everybody.
Back in 1989, I founded my first company, and the goal of that company was to answer the question, what would the world be like if you could put all of the world's knowledge 18 inches from the nose of every student in every school? Now, we built a system before there was a .com, before there was an internet. It was called the Homework Helper, and it was moderately successful, but I think today we know the answer to that question, and that is that it's tremendously empowering to have all of this information right at hand, not just 18 inches, but in our pockets. Now, is there an annoying downside? Yes, my wife will tell you, I settle bets all the time. The iPhone is never far from my hand. The most recent question, what was the nationality of Thor Heyerdahl? Trivia. But the fact is that the democratizing effect of access to information is a good. The downside is that what counts as information is something that we have yet to teach our children with any thoroughness, so that they are as likely to believe the bad stuff as the good. And by reference, I just ask you to Google or use whatever engine you wish to search the term Jew and see what you find. You won't be happy. Now, just as the answer to hate speech is not restrictions on speech, but is more speech, the answer to bad information is more information and better information. And so I look at the internet and this always-on, instantly available thing as in its infancy. When Ford first introduced his beginning mass market car, the Model T, you had to be pretty much an expert to operate it. Most of you in this room wouldn't know what a spark advance lever is, or how to crank an engine in order to get it started, And you certainly wouldn't understand having to have someone with a lantern walk 50 feet in front of you as you proceed down the road. I suspect that we think we've grown beyond most of those things. We have automatic transmissions now, and we have cars that almost think for themselves. And none of us think that an automatic transmission is a bad thing. I don't drive one, that's my personal choice. But we are at that infant stage of the internet. We're not even yet crawling. We're certainly not cruising. We will see radical developments. We will see retrenchments. We will see safeguards put in place. And ultimately, I think we will see the cypherpunks rule. That is, strong encryption will counter the bad things that we've seen. We will take the bad with the good, as we've heard strong encryption criticized by the head of the FBI, who says it will result in the death of a child. I'm sure that many children will die without strong encryption. I'm not sure that it will be a proximate cause.
I want to go to the point that Susan's raised in a couple of ways about the relationship between the internet connectedness and the power of government. So it is said that social media has resulted in liberalization around the world in many cases, has brought down governments. On the other hand, it's clearly the case that it can be turned into Big Brother or worse, where it allows a great deal more government intervention into our lives. Again, I'd like to get your sense of kind of the relative benefit versus burden with respect to the power of the state over us. Does the internet help break down that power, or does it make the state more powerful?
I mean, I think there is a certain, the internet it's not just disrupting, just every day-to-day lives, but I think, at least for people in my profession, I think it's posed a real challenge to the media business. And I don't mean just in terms of, the kinds of things you're looking and seeing, but as purveyors of information and news. What counted as news went through sort of a system of editors and reporters and, ultimately readers, right? Nowadays, with the internet, there's really no vetting, so to speak, and anyone can be a massive traffic driver and draw people to their site and spout nonsense things, accurate things, or inaccurate things, and to the reader, they don't know otherwise. And I think to the degree that the news media had, presented itself and acted as, the so-called fourth estate, as the eyes on government, it's sort of, the internet's had an effect on that ability, on its influence, but it's also potentially had an effect the other way in terms of where the government has eyes on everyone else. So I think that has yet to be solved. I don't know that it's something that will be solved. I think it still requires readers to become active readers, and I think that's part of education. And having to teach children, I teach my daughter how to read things, what to read, what to ignore, and that's a huge thing in and of itself. I don't know how academically that can be applied, but that is certainly a factor. And I think to the degree that the internet aids or abets that kind of sense of that panopticon that the government can engage in, that counterbalance that the news media used to, and still largely to this day, that function that they employ, that's been dulled, and I think that is something that hasn't really been sorted one or the other.
Well, I've been looking at the issues surrounding privacy for several years now, since long before Mr. Snowden's revelations. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that our generation, in the United States particularly, grew up in a quite anomalous privacy bubble, I call it. Because prior to 1890, there was really no legally recognized right to privacy. There were some traditions, of course, but it was future Justice Brandeis who gave us a law review article in which he advocated that there should be an official legal position on privacy that was not derived from the castle doctrine, your own home is your castle and should not be invaded. And for about 100 years, we had a developing jurisprudence and social sense of privacy, which was in equal parts derived from our urbanization, the ability to be anonymous in a large group urban setting, and not have people know what you were doing, quite different from the small town environment in which most people lived prior to 1890, but also a substantial body of law that grew up. I think in 1990 or thereabouts, that privacy bubble burst, and we simply didn't recognize it. In 1999, Scott McNealy, who founded Sun Microsystems and was one of the pioneers of the internet, was asked the question, what about privacy on the internet? And famously he said, it's the internet, you have no privacy anyway, get over it. Well, if we'd only heeded that advice, we might not be in such a pickle, because the traditional sense of privacy was, if you want it private, don't tell anyone about it. Or at least be circumscribed in how you tell people about it. And so I think we grew up in an era that encouraged us to shed some responsibility for our own privacy, to cede that privacy. Certainly the millennials and the younger generations will cede large swaths of privacy for a free song download. Their view of privacy is different. Their view of privacy is divorced from the view of security. And most of us of a certain age don't understand how those two can be disentangled. And so I think we're again evolving in our views. The internet certainly does permit an invasion of privacy. It does make that happen. But at the same time, that communications capability, that information function may prove to be all the more valuable. And I'll say it again, strong encryption solves a lot.
I want to follow up on that, which I think is a very good point, because I think a lot of people overheard the "you have no privacy, get over it." I think they heard that to say your technology is your destiny, you're never going to have privacy again, it's an old-fashioned value, and children of the 60s, forget it, there's not going to ever be privacy again. And I just don't think that's true. I think our technology is not our destiny. So at this point, given social media and all the information that's out there and the ease of getting information out there and the involuntary surveillance, I think you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Yeah, it's not going to be true that we're just going to have secrets that nobody ever knows because you put anything out there at all and it's going to be out there. Although I was very interested recently to read that a lot of the things on the internet do disappear. It's not true that everything's always available. But I think that what we can do is we can put some chains on the genie. President Obama just announced today that one of the things that he's doing about mass government collection of information is he's setting up some new controls on retention and dissemination. Now, I'm sure one of the Edward Snowden revelations was that all this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act stuff, in fact, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is used to collect information on Americans, which is regarded as incidental, but every conversation has two sides. So if you're aiming at the person overseas who's not an American, there could well be an American at the other end of the email or the telephone call. So what President Obama has now announced 13 years after 9/11 is, if we collect things incidentally on Americans just by accident under this authority, we won't keep them. Now, this may sound like, duh. A few years ago, there was a lawyer in Portland, Oregon named Brandon Mayfield who the FBI ended up focusing on him in a total mistake. They thought his fingerprint was the same as one that had been found in Spain in connection with that bombing of a train in Madrid. Total mistake, and there are many stories about how that mistake happened. But when the FBI focused on him, they did all sorts of surveillance of him and his family. They collected up his client records, they got everything from his computers, and because this incident had happened in Spain, they collected his children's Spanish homework and put that all in a file called Spanish Documents. Now, after it turned out that the Spanish police actually figured out whose fingerprint it was, and everyone figured out that the FBI had made a really bad mistake, the government apologized. They settled a lawsuit that Brandon Mayfield won against them because he'd been arrested. He had a horrible time. And a number of things happened that were positive, but what the government refused to do was to disgorge all the information like the Spanish homework. They just said, no, we're not going to do that. And there's a case in which there's a judge who's very frustrated because the judge wants to order them to do that, and they just say, we're not going to do it. And it ends up being a very strange story, one of the stories I tell in my book. But it seems to me that it's about time, 13 years after 9/11, that we figured out that we don't need to keep everybody's Spanish homework. So I think the whole idea that we can have legal limits on the government's retention and use and distribution of information is very important in terms of putting a chain on the genie. And I think we also have to get a lot better on controlling what companies can do with information. We don't have very good data privacy laws compared to most other non-third world countries in the world. And that turns out actually, ironically enough, to be very bad for American business. Okay, there are a lot of companies, other places. You may have heard of people in Brazil were starting to talk about, maybe they would start their own internet. Maybe they would start their own channels if our channels are not secure. And our channels are not secure against the government, and they're not secure against everyone else. So I think that, as you were both saying, I think there are a lot of pluses and minuses to all this information and connectedness, but I think we don't have to assume that because information goes out, that it can therefore go every place. I think there are many ways in which we can get control.
I think one element of this discussion I'd just like to add really quickly. I mean, we tend to think of privacy as an either or in terms of public versus the state. Talking about corporations and lack of security in general, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard about the Sony hack that happened. After that happened, we were one of the first news organizations to get access to a lot of that stolen data. And I was looking through it myself for reporting purposes, and I'm like, there's a lot of this stuff we just can't report because it's one source of information, even though it looks to be accurate. You can go back and verify. But basically, being privy to the last 4 months worth of emails of the CEO of a major corporation, see all the backs and forths and all this, sort of how he's thinking about stuff, it's pretty chilling. And so it isn't simply a function of to what degree the government wants to pry into what, your private dealings. The nature of the internet, the nature of this interconnectedness, in some ways the government will be less of a factor in terms of security than just the way things work. And hackers will just become more prevalent. There are a lot of hackers for hire, a lot of states that now hire hackers to do these kinds of intrusions. The US government, the US military is starting to see that, and I think what I foresee is sort of the emergence of like the fifth branch of the military, where I think cyber will be, it's a territory if you think about it. It's a virtual territory, but it's a territory nonetheless that needs to be protected. So I think going back to the phrase that the Sun Microsystems guy that you cited, I think the larger point there beyond whatever he personally meant was the nature of the internet is such that privacy just will not exist anymore anyway. Even if you want to put chains on it, even if you have all the best security, you have to always presume as soon as you type it, it's going to exist somewhere out there forever. And that's why I tell all my reporters, whenever you're communicating with people electronically, do so in a way that if someone else were to look at it, you wouldn't be embarrassed, or you're clearly doing the right thing. If it's something more sensitive, meet them in person and talk to them, which is always the best way to do reporting, but anyway.
If I could just follow up with one sentence, it seems to me that we don't have to choose between self-responsibility and regulation. That what you're saying is absolutely right in terms of you can't assume that something's going to remain private once you put it out there, and therefore you do have to think twice and control your own conduct. But that's not, it seems to me, inconsistent with or exclusive of the idea that we nevertheless need some government regulation about what the companies can do.
The expectation, of course,
the
yes, exactly, right.
We're going to do one more question here, and I'm going to ask for brief answers if we can, even though it's a big subject. While we're doing this, anybody who has a question in the audience, if you would please line up at one of the microphones on either side so that your question will be heard. Okay, so I want to real quickly move to a whole different topic that is incredibly important, and we could spend a whole day just on that. And this is artificial intelligence, right? So there have recently been some really rather bold statements made by people like Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, and Stephen Hawking, talking about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So I got a kind of a lightning round question. Are we going to see a future with intelligent machines that is more like the Jetsons or more like the Terminator?
I think it's going to be closer to the latter.
I think I'm going to leave that one to the science fiction writers.
I think we have a lot of misconceptions about artificial intelligence. Intelligence is really hard. Just look around at your fellow humans. We presently enjoy some things that are called narrow artificial intelligence, right? Your Roomba does an acceptable job of vacuuming the room sometimes, except when it doesn't. There are lots of such systems that give us real benefits. The anti-lock brake computer in your car is an artificial intelligence system, and it has saved countless lives. The computer that controls your airbags, the Nest that controls the heat in your house, despite my wife's continual complaint that it thinks she's away when she's merely not in the room. But if you look at the most advanced AI we have today, something like IBM's Watson that beat the human experts on Jeopardy, and you say to Watson, hey, let's go catch a Frisbee, well, you'd be better off taking your dog. Because we're not at that stage. What Musk and Hawking and Gates are saying is no more than what Asimov said in 1943. And that is, we need to be thinking about the rules that will govern the operation of these cybernetic systems, because they're not capable of evolving the rules on their own, consonant with our rules as human beings. And by the way, we've got 10,000 years at it, and we haven't agreed on what those rules are either. So we'd better be careful. That's all they're saying. They're not saying stop the research. They're simply saying, let's pay some attention. If you're interested in that type of long-term thinking, tune into longnow.org, the Long Now Foundation, where a lot of smart people are working on things that have 50, 100, and 10,000 year horizons so that it doesn't end up being Terminator.
Excellent. Okay. Questions from the audience, please. Go right ahead.
Thank you all for bringing up this conversation. And I want to say that, so you've talked about the internet and Facebook. And saying Facebook, I wrote, is like saying that you get your music from LPs. I think using the word Facebook is a generational thing. And so we need to update our own language, because I think now it's Instagram, Twitter. I mean, there's more to it. But we're using Facebook like it's Kleenex, the word Kleenex. But and then you use the word democracy. So my question really is, you've been talking about access to information on the internet, but you haven't really talked about whose internet it is and who has access to all of this. And in the news today, even just this morning, there was the report about trying to give more access to rural communities and that argument. So I just want to, if you could maybe just talk a little bit about the disparity of who has access and how this relates to connectedness in your minds. Thanks.
It's a very good question. I mean, whose internet? I think maybe you guys are better equipped to understand the legal ramifications of that. The actual functioning of the internet itself is actually, everyone owns little bits and pieces of it, and there's what's literally called an interconnection agreement between a lot of these different entities that own different portions of the pipe. The technical protocol, the language that's used to transfer information across these different sets of pipes is the thing that no one owns by themselves. It was developed in part through the US military back in the 50s and 60s and was adopted and then layered on top of it. This guy, a British computer scientist, developed language for the World Wide Web, which we all use now. And so it's not a clear answer, I know, but I think the larger issue has to do with who pays for the pipes. Right now, a lot of cable companies, a lot of telephone companies, of course, and then there are these what we call backbone companies that own the pipes that connect the different cable and telephone companies, and these are all the people we're paying. The piece of news you're referring to is local governments want to set up their own broadband networks to be able to give essentially free, conceivably, access to people. Of course, some of the cable companies don't like that idea because they currently have the market on this. And so that's unfortunately up in the air. But if it's something where a public entity decides we're going to give free access or create access, that certainly should be allowed. It's just at that point a function of what things cost versus who owns what.
One of the overriding issues of fairness and access to the internet is how are people outside the, quote, developed world going to get access? And just as a lot of the developing world leapfrogged this whole quaint concept of stringing wires on poles and went directly to cellular-based telephone systems, so too will their internet access rely on that. And a Time magazine issue about 4 weeks back highlighted the fact that now that there are over 1.1 billion users on Facebook, it may not be the au courant platform, but it sure is the one that all the dogs are eating the dog food from. The company has expressed a desire and has funded a project called the Next Billion. How do we get the next billion users online? And that relies on simple, cheap cell phones. Smartphones, but not $600 iPhones, rather $40 Android and other kinds of open source platform devices. It's reminiscent of the one laptop per child project that got started about a dozen years ago. Technology steamrollered that one into the dust several years ago. But today we have over 7 billion people on the planet, and over 5 billion of us have cell phones. It is not a stretch to think that the rest of all of us, or at least almost all of us, will have cell phones with access to the internet in the near future. 4 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored an innovation project contest, and one of the entries, the one that I submitted, was one that would have put all of the agricultural extension information around the world on a system that could be accessed with a text message. Because a single mother who is trying to farm in Botswana needs that information more than the guy trying to grow roses out in Chester County. We are there now. Google has built that, and they've built it for nothing. You can now query it.
But to be clear, there's sort of this tension that's brewing between companies like Google and Facebook, essentially the publishers of content or the creators of these connections, and the people who charge for access to content, right? And so Facebook and Google, they want people to access it for free, ideally, because that's how their business runs. If people can't get on the internet, they don't make any money.
But then there are other companies, of course, that are trying to make money out of preferential access. So one very important issue, when you talk about ownership, ownership isn't just the technical legal construct. It's really about the attributes of ownership. And being able to control access to the internet is a very important issue, which is why the ACLU is in favor of net neutrality. You know, there's a big issue of that going on right now. And the other important attribute of ownership in terms of who's controlling the internet itself, who's controlling the infrastructure. And in addition to the companies that are actually trying their best to do things, I thought you might be interested to know that in addition to the traditional things that the ACLU does about privacy, like litigate and lobbying, we have now hired somebody who's called an Internet Infrastructure Technologist. He's with our Speech Privacy and Technology Project, and his job, as he works with all these groups that I had to learn the names of, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the World Wide Web Consortium, and they work on security protocols and standards. And the basic idea here is that even aside from what laws there are governing privacy or the internet, you can bake in to the infrastructure a lot of different kinds of channels and protections. So what this specialist says is he compares what's going on here to, instead of being like a speed limit where the government says we're going to save lives by saying you can't drive above 55 miles an hour, there are other ways to save lives, which is you just put guardrails on the highway or you design safer cars. So in terms of who owns the internet, who is building in the infrastructure, who's making those decisions, is a much bigger question than what do the laws say or what do the laws require. Who's trying to profit from them and who's trying to control?
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to be behind all day because we're trying to cover, well, the world. We're going to take one more question here, and then we'll do a little leg stretching break to go into our next panel. Please.
I think it's pretty safe to say that technology has taken over everyone's life to some degree. So this conversation is occurring now in healthcare. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Temple, and we have EHRs, electronic health records. We have interoperability. We have all these benchmarks, and then you talk about the death of privacy. At what point does this dialogue change when we talk about human lives and human data that could change outcomes, could change the amount of things?
It's going to be the subject of our next panel, but, but that doesn't mean we can't get the expertise of these folks first.
Well, I think everyone in healthcare and everyone who consumes healthcare has had it up to here with HIPAA releases. We're asked to sign multi-page permission forms full of lawyer gobbledygook, allegedly that protect our personal privacy and which we know do no good. The issue is one that needs to be addressed more broadly in our country in particular with all sorts of personal privacy laws. The Europeans are way ahead of us on this, and we need to catch up. But in healthcare in particular, big data has a lot to offer us. And what that means is that the engineers who design the systems, not the doctors who use them for treatment and so forth, but the engineers who design them in the first place, need to be aware that they can design systems that preserve the medical information value while shielding the personal information. They need to divorce it. I'm in the middle of designing such a system myself, in which the diagnostic data will be free for use in research because it doesn't contain anything about who you are, but the information about you will be encrypted from the doctor all the way through the system. Unless we go back to first cases and redesign our systems, we'll rob ourselves of the ability to do the kinds of big data research that will ultimately lead to fully personalized medicine and solve a lot of our problems and bring us those tricorders that Craig talked about.
I want to thank our panelists for this first session today. We're going to move straight ahead so that we keep to a schedule as best as possible. If we could give our panelists a hand.